Talking smack is our knack. Jive is what keeps us alive. Our literary acrobatics are tried and true. We are wordsmiths through and through. From orature to the written text, African-American griots paint pictures of those they know best. Starting in the 1920s era, so you may see clearer how the Second Great Migration ushered in a righteous time when black was kin, when every jarhead's conch was made, laid flat with lye and pomade. Those southern transplants brought blues and jazz mixed with bad-tum drin, turning your face into a silly grin. Harlem Renaissance is the period's name. A revolutionary rebirth of black arts is its fame. In comes the Depression, the 1930s, the stock market crash. Most were feeling the whip of the economic lash. It's hard to compose a ditty when one's belly is dashed. In the 1940s, we are in the army now, fighting for someone else's freedom. Wow, they give us a gun and we will not run. We are in the army now. In the 1950s, we're in the army now. We fight for our own freedom. We won't bow. We return home after proving our chase, only to have our own try to put us in our place. We're in the army now. We're in the army now, broken neck, tattered coat, body beginning to bloat. Protest rallies and riots are held. Many are put in jail, not given bail. We're in the army now. To be young, gifted, and black is the battle cry of the day. Am I black enough for you? Racial pride is clearly on display. Loving our culture, connecting in diasporic thoughts with others whose only difference is where the boat docked. So they too fight for freedom, whether they be in Accra, Port-au-Prince, or Chicago, Timbuktu, Kingston, or Watts. I, Judah's lion roars, a battle cry across the diaspora soars as African people globally take a stand, refusing to sit on the back of the bus or carry a pass in their ancestral homeland. Reading Biko and Nkrumah and Fanon while Thelonious plays and Nina laments her rants and rays, Mississippi, she screams. And I can't say the rest, but I will attest her assessment was clearly the best to frame the civil unrest. 1960 to the present are the limits to which this portion is bound. Too much to cover to jack around. Covering the triumphs and struggles, music and literature highlights the scenes, flexing black power in shades of red, black, and green. From gospel to soul, from jazz to funk, from James Baldwin to Toni Morrison, from Maya Angelou to Amiri Baraka. Jimmy's psychedelic days and Prince's purple haze, and in between the fleeting moments of a disco craze. A bumping, funkadelic style built a chocolate city in a ball of confusion. Very suspicious ways, the blind man says. A prince arrives to dethrone the king of pop. Never let their music stop. They were brothers, not adversaries, sharing similar pains. Both gone too soon, forever let their music reign. Coming up through the Chitlin circuit, the Apollo, the Portofino, the Uptown Jew, scores of performers who came home to the dark-faced crowds where they knew they could say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Writing as Revolution Part 2, telling our tales from orature to storytelling. Welcome to Part 2 in our segment on African American literature, Writing as Revolution. In our last segment, we spoke to Dr. Amy Burge and explored the nature of orature in early African American literature. Dr. Burge graciously illustrated how the very acts of African refugees telling their stories in slave narratives and the writings of enslaved Phyllis Wheatley were acts of revolution within themselves. In this part, Part 2, telling our tales through orature and storytelling, we will continue to look at the African American writing, not only in the literary sense, but we will have the opportunity to see it in its performative sense as well. Habari Gani, what's the news? Telling our tales through orature and storytelling. Hello, and welcome to The Market on CCP TV, Educational Television, and I'm your host, Dr. Ardencia Hall Corambe. As a writer, educator, and content creator, Tracy Michelle Lewis Jiggets offers those who experience her work an authentic encounter, an opportunity to explore culture and identity at the most challenging levels. In addition to being a professor of English and creative writing at the Community College of Philadelphia, Tracy is the author of 9 books, a screenwriter, filmmaker, and founding publisher of New Seasons Books, an independent press in the Philadelphia area. As a freelance writer who has written for numerous print and online publications such as Ebony, The Guardian, and the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Most recently, Tracy was honored in 2016 for her blog conference by She Knows Media as one of the Voices of the Year for her nuance and creative perspective on mental health, PTSD, and self-care. Philly native, Nikki Powerhouse is a creative force that speaks to human nature. She received her BA in Theater and Communications from Temple University. Her credits include her one-woman show, The Art of I Am, at The Painted Bride, and as an off-Broadway show in New York with the United Solo Theater Festival. Also, she has written a poetry book entitled The Sun in the Mirror, Poetry as Memoir. Currently, her one-woman show will be presented this year at the Philly Fringe Festival. Keep up with Ms. Powerhouse with her performance through purchase of her book at the website nikkipowerhouse.com. Ladies, thank you very much for being here today. And this is part 2 of our topic as African American literature, writing as revolution. So the first question I want to ask is, do you believe that writing can be or has been a revolutionary act?
Storytelling for me is about healing, right? It's about telling the story. As writers, I think we're able to craft stories, whether it's our personal story or the story of a particular character, where we're looking at the brokenness of a character, the conflict that the character encounters. And when you think of storytelling as healing, obviously the systems that are in place don't want healed people, right? And so in that way, it's a revolutionary act, in that, once you are giving your story air, once you are telling the stories of your characters, you are ultimately having an individual kind of healing as well as a collective healing. And the systems that are in place to keep us in bondage, whether you're looking at it from a social standpoint or otherwise, psychological, mental, or whatever, they don't want healed people, right? And so I think writers and storytellers are on the ground zero when it comes to being revolutionary and countering that. And that's my perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for having me as well. I agree with Tracy. I think that the art of telling a story is such a revolutionary act within yourself, because I find that as a storyteller, it's like you're giving yourself permission moment to moment to tell your story in face of a system that keeps telling you not to do so. So it's always this fight within yourself and with the system. But when you take your sword and you take that pen and you start to write, it's like you taking your last breath, in order to tell the story. So I believe I believe that it's an act, and that's a powerful act.
Very much so. I totally agree. As a writer, I find that just the courage to sit down in front of the computer and look at the empty screen for a little bit, that's always the hardest part. But then putting that first word down and then watching it flow, and letting the emotion and the revolutionary ideas of letting myself speak freely. Because I think in many cases, especially as African American women, we've often been told to be quiet. So having that moment to actually find the space to write our stories down is revolutionary in itself. And that links us into a whole literary history of not only the written word, but also the oral storytelling itself and telling our story. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit in the sense that in the last part when we talked about from orature to the Harlem Renaissance, the spoken word until the written word of African Americans. And now we're going to jump from the Harlem Renaissance to the present and talk about how writing, African Americans have used revolutionary writing as a way to talk about their social lives, but also to talk about their personal selves. But how do you think the writing style has changed from the Harlem Renaissance to the present? How has that revolutionary streak either manifested in other forms or in other ways, or has dissipated altogether? Thoughts?
What's interesting about that is when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, I think there was a shift there that occurred in storytelling, particularly the written work. I think Black American writers, have often been asked to comment on social issues in the work, right? And that was always at the forefront, I think, prior to the Harlem Renaissance. So when Langston Hughes says, "I too sing America," we know what he's talking about. I am the darker brother. We know what he's saying, right? But I think in the Harlem Renaissance, and then even decades later in the Black arts movement, and then the so-called resurgence of Black literature in the 90s, I think what we see is writers deciding to eschew the white gaze and to look at more so characters as human beings, right? And so, yes, Zora Neale Hurston and Their Eyes Are Watching God are talking about the rural South. And as an anthropologist, she's looking at all the language and the dialect, and all of that is still there, the commentary on the social issues, right? But she's also talking about a woman in love, right? And relationships, and how the people treated Janie, right? And so I think they're in the early 20th century on, there was this interest from writers and storytellers to, yes, still talk about the circumstances, talk about the social issues, talk about the oppression, but also let characters and let our stories live and be human and have relationships. And I think in every single one of those kind of movements, and even in those gap years, right? So the time between the Harlem Renaissance and the Black arts movement, there was this gap, the war was happening, et cetera. You still see these stories where they're talking about us as emotional beings, as with, our mental health. All of those things are showing up. And Toni Morrison, she talks about kind of, I don't write for the white gaze, I write to Black people about Black people. And I think that is the difference, even in the writing style, in the choices that the writers and storytellers make in the work, is indicative of this kind of shift from focus on the movements, focus on the oppression, focus on what happened to us, as opposed to who we are in what happened. I think that is a huge difference.
Yeah.
Tracy said it all. Do you think that orature and traditional storytelling techniques still take part in modern day writing, in the storytelling itself?
One thing that I think that I'm seeing that I'm really fascinated by is digital storytelling and what's happening online. And we don't necessarily think of that as from, because when we think about traditional storytelling and orature, we think about that, we often disconnect that from what we see that's happening on the internet with social media, but I actually don't. I think when you see these Twitter feeds where people are telling story after story using Twitter or using Facebook, that is essentially call and response, because you are actually asking those who are reading to engage with what the story that you're telling. So if I start off, guess what happened to me the other day? This person, hit me in the car, and this is what they said. Next tweet, they said this, and then people are engaging with me. Well, what happened? Well, girl, and there is this kind of call and response that harkens back to what we've seen in the past. It's just happening in digital format. So I'm really curious about where that's going to go. Obviously, there's some other critiques around that's very different, but I think that at its base level, it can have the same impact and it can have the same effect with people reading it. So I just wanted to throw that in there when you talk about modern storytelling, because that's where we are. People every day are putting vignettes of their personal stories or creating characters and developing characters online. And even if you want to talk about developing personas, online, where they have this whole life that they're building, and we're following, the whole idea of following, to me harkens back to the griots. It's just in a different, it's the vessel in which the message is being, or the story that's being told is different. And so I think in that sense, there is some similarity.
And I think online has this way of like this demand to hear me.
Right.
And it's like if you look at it within the aspect of posting moment to moment.
Yeah.
I'm here, I'm there, this is, you know what I mean, just being constantly bringing audience to you, you know. So yeah.
And if you're not online, I find that if I haven't been online for a few days, I will get a message like, "Where are you? Where you been? You haven't tweeted anything in a while.
Yeah.
You haven't said anything. What's going on?" So there's definitely an audience. And so in that sense, you could say to a certain extent that writing not only, it takes on part of the element of the performative element to a certain extent of storytelling that we normally see when we go out to watch a storytelling in the world. So how did you both get into storytelling performance?
I think most of my work began when I was like 13 years old, and I tried out for audition for a theater, a talent show at the school I was in, and I just made up this story, like right on the spot, and I didn't know what I was just like trying it out, whatever, But after it was over, I realized that the story that I was speaking about was my own personal story. But what was really fascinating is how the students responded to me. And I was like, I didn't understand what that was until later I realized that it was improvisation. But the other elements of being able to live in that moment, take experiences and just kind of like live in that moment, even though it's in that moment. So after that, I just got really excited with it. Over time, I had to constantly always giving myself permission to show up in telling the story, because I think that the story is always ever flowing, always ever changing, and it's like, and you think it's like, oh, I made this great story, I did this great thing, and it's like there's more, and that more, you know the process that it takes to get the more out, and it's like, oh God, I don't want to, but I'm beginning to more so embrace what that is, because I know what it takes to dump, to bring it up and everything. So that's like that was my beginning, and then I went to the high school for performing arts, and we did a lot of work around, a lot of improvisation, and before I knew it, I started writing my own poetry and doing different doing open mics. And I realized that there was something there that not only use of my own story, but giving myself my own permission to feel myself really out loud in front of people. Like, it wasn't, and sometimes it was funny, sometimes it wasn't not so funny, but I was okay with exposing myself, if you will. I was okay with that.
You gave yourself permission to feel yourself out loud. That's a word.
That's a whole
That's a word.
Right there.
That's a word right there.
Indeed.
I let my mama tell it. I've been a storyteller my entire life, since birth, since I came out and was like, hey, Doc, let me tell you something.
Before.
Right?
Okay.
But I think formally, I've always written, so I was always writing stories. I kept a journal, all that. And then in high school, I began to write plays. And so I wrote plays for like Black History Month, and then plays for my church. And so that's really kind of the idea of story as performance. That's where it began. And then I got caught up in the spoken word scene and began to deliver my poetry. Then realized very early on that I preferred the written word. And so began to write books and write plays and now film from that perspective. But from early on, I really think that story was all around me, and I just kind of stepped in. So I love what you were just saying, because I feel like I just stepped into the stories that were already being told around me, and then it just kind of was funneled through my lens, my experience. And so that for me very early on was just, chronicling what's going on around me, and then putting that on the stage, and then putting that on the page. It's kind of how my journey went.
Okay. So right now, we're going to give you both an opportunity to bless us with some of your work. I asked both of the artists to come in and to either read something that they wrote or read something that someone else wrote or perform something. So we're going to start with Tracy, and she is going to, what are you reading for us today?
It's actually interesting because what I'm reading is some monologues. It's like 3 short vignettes, monologues from a play that I co-wrote called Capera, which is interesting because this young lady here was on the original cast of Capera. She played Earthwoman, and I wrote most of her role, and she was absolutely phenomenal. And so I'm actually going to be reading the 3 spirits that are characters in the play that are from the past, that are kind of telling their story and talking to the present day characters, the generation that's kind of working through some stuff. So these 3 characters, very short vignettes from each one. So that's what I'm reading. What they know about the blues, what they knows about being black and blue, what they know about true blue skies, what do they know about the blues? They called me Titi La'o when I walked the earth with feet made of flesh and bone. I remember my home, my village, where I could feel the earth breathing under the soles of my feet, and how the baobab tree would embrace me with outstretched arms whenever the wind would stop by to converse about mysteries of the sky. In my village, where water was for cleansing and tears were for healing, we prayed. In our own way, we prayed. We prayed for the body that was sick and tormented. We prayed for the spirit because we knew the body was only manifesting the spirit's illness, and you cannot heal the flesh without healing the spirit first. Ah, yes, we believed in the power of prayer even before they came with the Bibles and guns. And when our ancestors in waiting made their transition, we mourned them not because we felt sorry, but because we wanted to cleanse ourselves so that we may bid our loved ones farewell and go about the business of living. Death to us was not an ending, but a beginning, a rebirth. This is what we believed in my village, where water was for cleansing and tears were for healing. These things I learned when they called me Titi La'o. Happiness comes from within, and I walk the earth with feet made of flesh and bone. But now that I fly, these things I teach. I was called Odessa when nations were born on my blood and sweat. Yes, it was at this time a colored child was conceived on my tears, and they gave me this here name, Odessa. I'm told it means long journey, and a long journey it has been. I'm also told I was born to a big, strong African woman, but that's all I knows about my mama. I has no idea who my daddy was, but from the color of things, I reckon he wasn't no Negro. But my dear raised me, and she raised me well. Grown folk called her Mama Millie. They also called her an angel because she could sing a soul to freedom, even if freedom was only in our minds. What they know about the blues, about being black and blue. Shoot, I is the blues. I created it with calloused feet, blood-split backs, blistered hands, heat-soaked skin, rape-infested wounds, nursing nipples, knowledge-hungry minds, tamed wild spirits with freedom-craving appetites. Oh, we knew about the blues because we sang every heartache and danced every pain. And at the end of a hard day, that's all we had was songs of hope and stories of freedom. But my children, they done forgot. They forgot the way it was. But I ain't forget, because I lived it. I remember, and I remember well. I was called Odessa, and a nation was born on my blood and sweat. It was this time a colored child was conceived on my tears, and they gave me this here name, Odessa. It means long journey, and a long journey it still is. What you know about the blues, huh? Tell you what I know about the blues. The blues is where all that jazz come from. Ska-da-da-da. And I know all about razzmatazz jazz, because I was Nina when the lights went up. And I danced for white faces in dark spaces. When Harlem was in vogue and white folks wanted a little soul, they came up to 125th Street to watch my dancing freak. Cotton Club, that's where we entertain. What you know about the blues? It's the birthplace of syncopated rhythms where Jelly Roll found his soul and Lady Day found her fame. The blues? During the Renaissance, we thought we could dance the blues all away. Because we were educated colored folk, refined and redefined, artistic and optimistic. But we couldn't get away. Because the blues, it was in our soul. Langston Hughes even said so. And the fact is, Zora went down south to collect our stories, but she died without a penny or glory. So no matter how we living, we all come back to eat from sorrow's kitchen. But that's what makes our music have wings. Our dancing feet sound like thunder, and our voices cry like the wind. It's our blues that keeps us alive. And when my body was alive, I was Nina when the lights came up. And I danced for white faces in dark spaces. This was the time when Harlem was in vogue. Why? It's what our oppressors have always known. They can enslave our bodies, but they can never capture our souls.
Thank you, Tracy. That was absolutely wonderful. The words were beautiful, and your performance, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Next, we're going to have Nikki Powerhouse do some cuttings from her play, The Art of I Am.
Grandmother Tucker says my voice and her voice are one. Then I am my great-great-great-grandmother's laughter. The sound of her voice cradles me in my night dreams, and when I look at her, she inspires me to reach deep down inside me and paint the sky emerald green. Her voice travels through autumn leaves while all the children, we sit under the sycamore trees and we listen with our hearts and mind wide open as she delivers earth messages through rhythmic breaths. She tells me, she tells you, each and every one of you, hand-plucked from heaven's branches and sowed into the earth's soil to sprout, to bloom. Children, remember your first name. Children, each and every one of you, shaped and saturated in the stars, reflecting perfect light, painted in gold and outlined in silver, your smile alone is the sunrise, carved into sculptures of undeniable beauty. Children, remember your first name. Remember the bottom deck. Backs ache, sore by the mother's rape. Witness the sister use her body as bait. As we sat in the corner and wailed in the weight of reaching an unfamiliar place, death became a rotten taste. Children, remember your first name. Your first name is I Am. Your last name is brilliant. Your first name is I Am. Your last name is powerful. Your first name is I Am. Your last name is possible. Children, remember your first name.
Thank you, Nikki. As always, your performance was heartwarming and touching. I love watching you perform. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we've had the honor of having Tracy and Nikki come on stage and show us performance. The Black body in performance is political. It is revolutionary. And with that, that's all the time we have today. And I would like to thank my guest for coming today. And you've been watching The Market on CCP TV, Community College of Philadelphia's Emmy-nominated educational channel. Till next time, thank you.